Picture this: a castle rising from the morning mist, its stone walls towering over the land like a silent sentinel. It's more than just a fortress, it's a statement. A declaration of power carved in rock and mortar. But who truly built these monumental structures? Not just the hands that laid the stones, but the minds that envisioned them. The medieval engineers, the unsung architects of empires. For centuries, we've credited kings and knights with shaping history. But what if the real rulers of the Middle Ages weren't the ones wearing crowns, but the ones holding the blueprints? These masterminds didn't just construct buildings, they designed the very framework of power, turning raw materials into instruments of control that reshaped kingdoms. Think about it: a well-placed castle could decide the fate of a war. A cathedral's soaring spire could unite or intimidate an entire population. The right siege engine could crumble walls that had stood for generations. Every innovation, from hidden tunnels to fortified bridges, was a chess move in the grand game of medieval politics. These engineers weren't just craftsmen, they were strategists, wielding geometry and physics like weapons. Their work dictated where armies marched, where trade flourished, and even where people prayed. They were the invisible hand guiding the rise and fall of dynasties. So how did these brilliant minds operate in the shadows? How did a sketch on parchment transform into a weapon of mass intimidation or a symbol of divine authority? Over the next minutes, we'll uncover the secrets of these forgotten geniuses, from the guilds that honed their skills to the daring innovations that defied the limits of their time. We'll explore how a trebuchet's precise calculations could topple a kingdom, how a cathedral's arches whispered both prayer and power, and how the control of water and roads meant the control of empires. This is the story of how engineering didn't just support medieval power, it created it, and by the end, you'll never look at a castle, a cathedral, or even a cobblestone road the same way again. At first glance, medieval construction sites might seem like chaotic gatherings of laborers hauling stones, but behind every rising wall stood a mastermind: the engineer. These weren't just skilled hands, they were visionaries who combined the precision of mathematicians with the creativity of artists. Before the 12th century, many of these builders worked in obscurity, their names lost to time. But as kingdoms grew hungrier for power, everything changed. Suddenly, the ability to design an impregnable fortress or a cathedral that touched the clouds became more valuable than 1,000 swords. The guild system was the crucible where these masters were forged. Picture a young apprentice, his fingers smudged with ink, hunched over parchment in a dim workshop. For years, he'd grind pigments, mix mortar, and study the cryptic sketches of his elders. Guilds weren't just trade unions, they were secret societies of knowledge. Techniques for calculating load-bearing arches or reinforcing walls against siege engines were guarded like royal treasures. Advancement came slowly through grueling trials. An apprentice might spend a decade mastering geometry before he'd even touch a compass. But for those who persevered, the rewards were immense. A certified master builder could travel across Europe, his skills in demand from Normandy to Byzantium. Take Villard de Honnecourt, a 13th century engineer whose sketchbook survives as a window into this world. His pages are a riot of ideas, detailed plans for sawmills, lifting devices, even a perpetual motion machine, though that one remained a pipe dream. What's striking is how fluidly he moved between art and engineering. One moment, he's sketching a rose window's delicate tracery. The next, he's calculating the force distribution of a flying buttress. This wasn't just drafting, it was a new way of thinking. nobles began to realize that a brilliant engineer could give them an edge no army could match. Patronage transformed these craftsmen into celebrities. When King Philip II of France wanted to secure his borders, he didn't just hire laborers. He poached the best engineers from rival territories. Suddenly, the man who could design a concentric castle with overlapping fields of arrow fire was worth his weight in gold. Contracts from this period reveal astonishing details. Some master builders were paid in silver, granted lands, even excused from taxes. Their work wasn't seen as mere labor, it was strategic innovation. A well-placed castle could choke off enemy supply lines. A fortified bridge could turn a sleepy river into a toll booth for wealth. Geometry was their silent weapon. While knights trained with swords, engineers wielded compasses and astrolabes. They knew that a wall angled at precisely 75 degrees could deflect boulders hurled by trebuchets. They understood that the Fibonacci sequence borrowed from Arabic mathematicians could dictate the proportions of a tower both beautiful and unshakable. This wasn't guesswork, it was applied science centuries before the Renaissance, and their mastery of materials was just as crucial. They learned to age mortar by mixing it with goat's blood for flexibility, or to quarry limestone that hardened over time rather than crumbled. By the late Middle Ages, the engineer had become something new, a hybrid of artist, scientist, and diplomat. When the Duke of Burgundy needed to awe visiting dignitaries, he didn't just show them his jewels, he led them through vaulted halls where sunlight streamed through stained glass in calculated rays, a spectacle engineered to humble. In an age where power was as much about perception as force, these builders became the ultimate status symbols. To employ the finest engineer was to announce that your ambition wasn't bound by earth or stone. And as we'll see next, their greatest creations weren't just buildings, they were psychological weapons carved in mortar and shadow. Castles were never just stone and mortar, they were chess pieces in a high-stakes game of intimidation. Picture a Welsh rebel in the late 13th century, staring up at the towering walls of Caernarfon Castle. Its polygonal towers and banded masonry mimicked the walls of Constantinople, a deliberate message. This wasn't just a fortress, it was a piece of empire transplanted onto conquered soil. Edward I's Iron Ring of castles across Wales wasn't merely about defense, it was psychological warfare. By planting these monstrous structures along the coast and rivers, he didn't just control the land, he crushed the spirit of resistance. Every time a local farmer glanced at those walls, they were reminded rebellion was futile. The secret to their dominance lay in ruthless innovation. Concentric walls, a castle within a castle, turned sieges into suicide missions. Attackers who breached the outer curtain wall would find themselves trapped in a killing zone, exposed to arrows from the even higher inner walls. Murder holes, those innocuous-looking gaps in the ceiling, became instruments of terror. Boiling oil or quicklime could rain down on invaders, turning narrow stairwells into death traps. Engineers didn't just build barriers, they designed entire ecosystems of violence. Even the spiral staircases were weapons built clockwise to disadvantage right-handed attackers swinging swords upward. But perhaps their greatest genius was how they bent nature to their will. At Conwy Castle, engineers integrated the structure into a rocky coastal outcrop, making the cliffs themselves part of the defense. The moat wasn't just dug, it was strategically positioned to redirect river water, creating a liquid barrier that also supplied the garrison. These weren't generic blueprints, they were custom solutions tailored to exploit every hill, forest, and waterway. A castle on a hill didn't just offer a vantage point, it became a permanent shadow over the villages below, a constant reminder of who held power. The symbolism extended beyond brute strength. Take the imposing gatehouses, often decorated with statues of lions or mythical beasts. These weren't mere decorations, they were the medieval equivalent of a "keep out" sign, broadcasting the owner's wealth and sophistication. Inside, grand halls with towering fireplaces showcased hospitality, but only to those invited. The same space that hosted feasts could become a courtroom or a prison, flexing between generosity and brutality. This duality was the castle's real power. It could be a shield or a sword, depending on the moment. Even in ruin, their legacy lingers. Modern military bases still use principles of layered defense inspired by concentric castles. The psychology hasn't changed either, whether it's a medieval keep or a modern embassy. Architecture still speaks the language of control. These structures didn't just house kings, they were the original propaganda machines, carved in stone and impossible to ignore. And as we'll see next, the same engineering minds that mastered the art of intimidation would turn their skills to a very different, but equally powerful canvas: the soaring vaults of cathedrals. Cathedrals didn't just reach for the heavens, they anchored power to earth. Step inside Notre Dame as the morning sun streams through its rose windows, painting the stone floor in kaleidoscopic colors. This wasn't just beauty, it was theater. Every arch, every stained glass panel, every echoing vault was meticulously designed to humble the peasant and exalt the powerful. These soaring structures were the medieval equivalent of a crown jewel, a fusion of faith and politics so potent it could unite kingdoms or crush dissent with a single glance upward. The secret to their dominance lay in engineering breakthroughs like the flying buttress. Picture these stone ribs arcing away from the walls like the skeletal wings of a gargantuan bird. They weren't just supports, they were liberation. By redirecting the weight of the roof outward, engineers could replace thick, fortress-like walls with delicate curtains of glass. The result, walls that seemed to dissolve into light, creating the illusion that the entire structure floated on divine breath. For a medieval worshipper, this was more than architecture. It was a physical manifestation of God's grace, and by extension, the authority of the church that claimed to channel it. But light wasn't just spiritual, it was hierarchical. Notice how the nave's towering height forced visitors to crane their necks upward, their eyes drawn inexorably to the altar where bishops stood bathed in celestial radiance. The message was unmistakable. Power flowed downward from heaven to clergy to flock. Even the seating arrangements reinforced this. While nobility occupied ornate chapels along the sides, commoners packed the central aisle, their bodies literally oriented toward the ruling class. The cathedral wasn't just a house of worship, it was a three-dimensional diagram of feudal order. Kings and bishops didn't just fund these projects, they weaponized them. Take Reims Cathedral, where French monarchs were crowned. Its sculpted portals showed biblical kings alongside contemporary rulers, blurring the line between divine right and earthly authority. The building itself became a stage for political theater. When a king processed down that long aisle, flanked by stained glass depictions of Solomon and David, he wasn't just walking, he was performing a carefully engineered spectacle of legitimacy. The construction process itself was a tool of control. Building a cathedral could take generations, employing thousands of masons, carpenters, and glassmakers. This wasn't just a jobs program, it was a way to bind communities to the church's vision. Donations of labor or money were framed as acts of piety, turning economic investment into spiritual capital. Even the relics housed within a saint's fingerbone, a splinter of the true cross, served a dual purpose. They drew pilgrims whose spending enriched the town, while their veneration reinforced the church's monopoly on salvation. Yet for all their grandeur, these buildings had a darker engineering secret. They were designed to adapt. the same vaults that echoed with chants could, in times of revolt, store grain or shelter armies. Crypts meant for saints' bones doubled as treasure vaults or prisons. This flexibility made cathedrals the ultimate power tools, spiritual one moment, practical the next. Their spires might point to heaven, but their foundations were firmly planted in the messy, calculating world of medieval politics. And as we'll soon see, the same minds that crafted these monuments of light would also perfect machines of pure destruction, transforming timber and rope into weapons that could shake empires. A battering ram slams against a fortress gate once, twice, until the wood splinters like kindling. But this isn't brute force at work, it's physics perfected. Medieval siege engines weren't just tools of destruction, they were masterclasses in applied mathematics, turning timber and rope into instruments of conquest. Consider the trebuchet, the crown jewel of medieval artillery. Unlike its simpler cousin, the catapult, a trebuchet didn't rely on twisted ropes for power. Its secret lay in counterweights, massive lead or stone boxes that could weigh as much as 20 tons. When released, that weight sent the throwing arm whipping forward, launching a 200-pound stone over 300 yards with terrifying precision. Engineers didn't just build these machines, they fine-tuned them like concert pianos, adjusting sling lengths and pivot points until the projectile struck the same weak point in a wall, over and over, like a hammer chiseling a fault line. The Siege of Acre in 1291 revealed just how game-changing these innovations could be. As Crusader and Mamluk forces clashed over this coastal stronghold, it wasn't just soldiers who decided the battle, it was engineers. The Mamluks deployed counter-trebuchets, positioned to intercept incoming projectiles mid-air. They even used incendiary rounds wrapped in hemp and soaked in naphtha, creating fireballs that could ignite entire sections of the city. But the Crusaders had tricks of their own. Their engineers devised torsion springs made from twisted ox sinew, allowing smaller, mobile catapults to pummel enemy positions with rapid bursts. This wasn't just a war of strength. It was a duel of calculus and creativity, where the side with the better formulas won. What made these machines truly revolutionary was their demand for secrecy. The dimensions of a trebuchet's throwing arm or the exact ratio of counterweight to projectile were guarded closer than royal jewels. Manuscripts from the period show sketches with deliberate errors, decoys to mislead spies. Engineers became walking targets, often kidnapped or bribed by rival lords. At the siege of Château-Gaillard, French King Philip Augustus reportedly paid a defecting English engineer his weight in silver for the schematics of the castle's weak points. Knowledge wasn't just power, it was the difference between a kingdom's survival and its collapse. Yet siege engines did more than break walls, they reshaped geopolitics. When Edward I brought his Warwolf trebuchet to Stirling Castle in 1304, its mere assembly terrified the Scottish defenders into surrender. The message was clear: resistance meant annihilation. Conversely, cities with reputations for impregnable walls like Carcassonne avoided attacks altogether, their defenses acting as invisible shields. Diplomacy shifted too. Alliances formed around shared siege technology, like the Germanic states pooling resources to develop the Blide, a trebuchet variant that could hurl diseased carcasses over walls, turning biology into a weapon. The legacy of these machines lingers in surprising ways. Modern artillery still relies on the same principles of trajectory and counterbalance, proving that medieval engineers weren't just builders. They were the original physicists of warfare. Their creations didn't just change battles, they rewrote the rules of power, proving that sometimes the pen, or in this case, the precisely calibrated sling, was mightier than the sword. And as we'll see next, the same minds that harnessed destruction would turn their skills to something far subtler, the silent, liquid power of water. Water flowed through medieval cities like blood through veins, and the engineers who controlled its currents held the life of kingdoms in their hands. Picture the London Bridge in the 13th century, not just as a crossing but as a pulsating engine of commerce. Beneath its arches, massive water wheels churned the Thames, their wooden paddles driving grain mills that fed thousands. But these weren't just flour factories, they were economic throttles. By regulating the flow of water to the mills, engineers could dictate which bakeries prospered and which faltered, turning a natural resource into a tool of patronage. The bridge's very design was a feat of political engineering. Its 19 arches funneled river traffic into narrow channels, forcing merchants to pay tolls or face treacherous currents. Water wasn't just harnessed, it was weaponized. Moats reveal another layer of this liquid strategy. Far from mere defensive ditches, they were multitasking marvels. At Kenilworth Castle, the moat's shimmering surface concealed a network of sluice gates that could flood the surrounding fields in hours, creating impassable marshlands to stall advancing armies. Yet by day, those same waters carried waste away from latrines, preventing disease outbreaks among garrison troops. This duality was no accident. Engineers understood that sanitation was as vital as security. A healthy population was a loyal one. In cities like Bruges, intricate canal systems doubled as trade routes and sewers, with locks engineered to flush debris into designated basins at high tide. Clean water meant fewer revolts, and fewer revolts meant stable tax revenues. The true mastery lay in scale. Consider the Cistercian monks of Clairvaux Abbey, who diverted an entire river into a man-made channel to power their forges and workshops. Their system of ponds and sluices functioned like a medieval power grid, with water released in timed bursts to maximize efficiency. Nearby towns soon copied these designs, clustering industries along engineered waterways like beads on a string. This wasn't just innovation, it was urbanization by design. Kings took note when Philip Roman II of France wanted to tighten his grip on Normandy. He didn't just build castles, he funded aqueducts that prioritized loyal towns, leaving rebel regions parched. Thirst, it turned out, was a faster route to submission than swords. The legacy of these aqueous architects still ripples through modern cities. Today's flood barriers and hydroelectric dams operate on principles medieval engineers would recognize. Control the water and you control the people. Their greatest insight wasn't technical but philosophical. Civilization doesn't just need water, it needs water directed with purpose. Every turning mill wheel, every gated canal, was a reminder that the real currents of power flow not in palaces, but in the channels dug by those who understood the alchemy of earth and water. Beneath the towering walls of Dover Castle, a shadow world thrived, narrow tunnels snaking through chalky bedrock like hidden veins. These weren't just escape routes, they were the medieval equivalent of a spy satellite system, engineered for stealth and psychological dominance. Imagine a sentry pacing the battlements, unaware that beneath his feet, enemy soldiers crept through a labyrinth designed to amplify their whispers. The tunnel's walls were carved at precise angles to funnel sound, turning stone into a natural eavesdropping device. A conspirator's mutter in a tavern cellar could travel up a ventilation shaft straight to the ears of the castle's constable. Sound wasn't just heard, it was weaponized. The real genius lay in the details. At Chepstow Castle, spiral staircases doubled as acoustic traps, their tight curves capturing and magnifying footsteps from 3 levels below. Engineers even embedded hollow tubes within walls, disguised as structural pillars, that functioned like primitive wiretaps. One surviving design from Burgundy shows a listening chamber beneath a great hall, where a guard could press his ear against a thin stone diaphragm to monitor conversations above. These innovations transformed architecture into an intelligence-gathering machine, blurring the line between masonry and espionage. But tunnels weren't just for listening, they were for striking. The siege of Rochester Castle in 1215 revealed their deadly potential. When King John's sappers dug beneath the southeast tower, they didn't just collapse the foundation, they packed the tunnel with flammable pig fat, creating an underground explosion that cracked the tower like an egg. This wasn't brute force, it was geological surgery, exploiting weak strata in the bedrock. Later castles countered with countermines, branching tunnels where defenders could intercept diggers in claustrophobic hand-to-hand combat. The ground itself became a battlefield. Perhaps the most chilling use of these subterranean networks was psychological. At Chateau Gaylord, rumors spread of a phantom passage that allowed the garrison to appear and disappear at will. In reality, it was a cleverly disguised sally port, a hidden door masked by false mortar lines. But the myth alone sapped besiegers' morale. Engineers mastered the art of deception, constructing dummy tunnels that ended in traps or fake weak points to lure attackers into kill zones. The goal wasn't just to defend, it was to make enemies question every footstep, every shadow. These underground systems left a lasting legacy. Modern military bunkers still use principles of acoustic monitoring pioneered in medieval tunnels, while the CIA's Cold War era listening posts beneath Berlin echoed the same clever tricks. The real lesson wasn't about stone or sound, it was about control. By mastering the unseen, medieval engineers proved that the most powerful threats aren't the ones you can face head-on, but the ones you never see coming. And as we'll discover next, their ambitions stretched far beyond castle walls, to the roads and bridges that stitched kingdoms together with threads of trade and tyranny. Roads were the silent conquerors of the medieval world, ribbons of packed earth and stone that bound rebellious regions to royal will, while castles projected power through intimidation and cathedrals through awe. Infrastructure worked its magic more subtly. A well-placed bridge could turn a sleepy river into a toll booth for wealth, while a neglected road might starve a rebellious town into submission. The Romans had understood this centuries earlier, building highways that held their empire together like iron stitching. Now, medieval engineers revived those ancient techniques, adapting them to a fractured world of competing kingdoms. Take the Pont d'Avignon, that iconic half-bridge jutting into the Rhône. Its construction in the 12th century wasn't just a feat of engineering, it was an economic masterstroke. By controlling this critical crossing, the Papal States effectively held a chokehold on trade between the Mediterranean and Northern Europe. Merchants hauling silks from Italy or wool from Flanders had no choice but to pay the toll, or risk a treacherous detour through bandit-infested hills. The bridge's arches were built narrow by design, forcing carts to slow to a crawl for inspection. Even its missing span was strategic. During wartime, a removable wooden section could be yanked away, turning the river into a moat. But roads were more than revenue streams, they were information highways. Royal couriers could cover 60 miles a day on well-maintained routes like England's Ermine Street, relaying orders faster than rebellion could spread. Maintenance wasn't left to chance. Records from the reign of Henry Roman II show sheriffs fined for potholes deeper than a horse's hoof, a standard enforced by iron measuring rods carried by road wardens. Smooth surfaces meant swifter armies, and swifter armies meant rebellions could be crushed before they gained momentum. The real power lay in the details. A bridge's width might seem trivial until you realize it was calibrated precisely to accommodate marching columns wide enough for 3 armored knights abreast, but too narrow for peasant carts to block retreating troops. Road curves were engineered to steer travelers past royal manors where supplies and taxes could be extracted, while bypassing rival lords' territories entirely. Even roadside ditches served dual purposes, draining water to prevent mud, yes, but also making ideal ambush spots for tax collectors to pounce on smugglers. Perhaps the most revealing innovation was the four stones system used along the Camino de Santiago. At regular intervals, engineers placed marker stones not just to guide pilgrims, but to measure distances for toll calculations. The stones also bore carvings of local lords' coats of arms, a constant reminder of whose authority funded the road. This was psychological engineering at its finest. Every footstep reinforced the hierarchy. The legacy of these designs still shapes our world. Modern highway systems echo the medieval principle that connectivity equals control. Think of how interstate exits funnel traffic past gas stations and rest stops owned by the same conglomerates. The next time you cross a bridge or idle at a toll booth, remember, you're participating in a system of power as old as the first king who realized that to rule the land, you must first pave it. The clink of coins in medieval Florence wasn't just the sound of commerce. It was the heartbeat of power, meticulously engineered to keep kingdoms alive. Behind every tax ledger and royal treasury stood an often overlooked figure, the financial architect. These engineers didn't just build walls, they constructed entire systems to track, protect, and multiply wealth with the same precision they applied to cathedral vaults. Take the Florentine Mint, a fortress within a fortress. Its doors weren't merely locked, they were protected by mechanisms so intricate that only 3 officials, each holding a separate key, could open them together. The vaults themselves were layered like onions, with outer chambers decoying thieves, while the real treasures lay behind false floors engineered to sing like hollow bells if tampered with. This wasn't just security, it was psychological theater designed to make even the greediest hands think twice, but the real innovation lay in the coins themselves. Medieval engineers revolutionized minting with screw presses, a technology adapted from winemakers' tools. These machines could stamp out perfectly uniform coins at 10 times the speed of hammered currency, each flaunting the king's face with crisp, unforgeable detail. In England, the Tower Mint's engineers went further, devising a system of coin weights so precise that merchants could detect counterfeit pennies by their balance alone. Suddenly, money wasn't just metal. It was a standardized instrument of control, allowing kings to collect taxes across continents without dispute. The exchequer buildings where these coins were counted reveal even deeper genius. Westminster's famous checkered cloth, a giant accounting grid, wasn't just a calculator. It was a data visualization tool centuries ahead of its time. Officials moved black and white pebbles across its squares to track debts and surpluses, creating a public spectacle of fiscal transparency that discouraged embezzlement. The room itself was engineered for accountability, with high windows ensuring transactions took place in full daylight, while the echoing acoustics made whispered corruption impossible. War finance showcased their most ruthless ingenuity. When Edward I needed funds for his Scottish campaigns, engineers designed mobile mints that followed his army, melting down looted church silver into coins on the spot. These instant currencies paid soldiers and suppliers, keeping conquests liquid. Meanwhile, in Siena, engineers built underground aqueducts that doubled as treasure pipelines, funneling war taxes directly from merchant guilds to the city's armories without risking bandits. The legacy of these fiscal architects is everywhere today, from bank vaults with seismic sensors to blockchain's unbreakable ledgers. Their greatest insight was simple: wealth isn't just about gold, but about the systems that guard and grow it. They understood that a kingdom's true strength wasn't measured in the weight of its coffers, but in the ingenuity of those who built the locks around them. The quiet cloisters of medieval monasteries hid a secret. These weren't just houses of prayer, but power plants of innovation humming with water wheels and forges. At Cluny Abbey, the rhythmic clang of trip hammers echoed through the night as monks engineered iron tools with a precision that rivaled any royal armory. Far from retreating from the world, these religious communities became the medieval equivalent of Silicon Valley startups, merging spiritual devotion with mechanical genius. Their scriptoria weren't merely copying scripture, they were preserving and refining engineering knowledge from antiquity, turning parchment into prototypes for everything from windmills to mechanical clocks. Water was their silent partner in this revolution. The Cistercians, in particular, transformed remote valleys into hydro-industrial complexes. At Clairvaux Abbey, a network of canals diverted river water to power grain mills, fulling machines for wool, and even ore-crushing hammers for metalwork. Each mill's placement was calculated with geometric precision. Too close to the abbey, and the noise disrupted prayer; too far, and it became vulnerable to thieves. The monks didn't just use technology, they sanctified it, inscribing crosses on waterwheel axles as if blessing the very gears of progress. Their agricultural innovations were equally groundbreaking. Monastic vineyards pioneered trellising techniques that doubled grape yields, while their crop rotation systems alternating wheat, barley, and fallow fields kept soils fertile for generations. At Fountains Abbey, engineers designed a drainage system so effective it turned swampy Yorkshire lowlands into prime grazing land. These weren't just practical solutions, they were economic engines. The surplus from monastic farms funded grand building projects, turning remote cloisters into pilgrimage destinations that rivaled cities in wealth and influence. Perhaps their most subversive power lay in knowledge management. In scriptoria lit by precisely angled windows for optimal daylight, teams of monks copied not just religious texts but works by Roman engineers like Vitruvius. These manuscripts became the API of medieval innovation: recipes for mortar that could set underwater, designs for cranes that could lift cathedral stones, even instructions for water clocks that regulated prayer times. When Abbot Suger rebuilt St. Denis in the 12th century, he didn't just rely on divine inspiration. He consulted these technical manuals to create the first truly Gothic arches. The irony is profound. While kings fought over land, monks quietly mastered the systems that made land valuable. Their estates became living laboratories where faith and physics intertwined, where the quest for spiritual perfection led to tangible breakthroughs in metallurgy, agriculture, and hydraulics. The same hands that penned illuminated gospels also sketched gear mechanisms for automated bell ringers. This fusion of piety and practicality gave monastic orders something more durable than armies: self-sufficiency. While feudal lords starved during droughts, monasteries thrived, their granaries stocked thanks to engineered irrigation. What made these monk engineers truly revolutionary was their approach to scale. The Benedictine network, a sprawling franchise of over 15,000 monasteries, shared innovations like a medieval open-source community. A watermill design perfected in Burgundy would appear in Bavaria within a decade, adapted to local rivers. This knowledge web, woven through parchment and pilgrimage routes, became Europe's first true intellectual infrastructure. Long before corporations had research and development departments, monastic orders were institutionalizing innovation, proving that sometimes the path to heaven was paved with precisely calibrated machinery. The Black Death didn't just empty cities, it rewrote the rules of engineering. When the plague swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, wiping out nearly half the population, the survivors faced an impossible dilemma: how to rebuild a world with so few hands left to work. What emerged from this devastation wasn't just desperation, but a wave of ingenuity so profound it reshaped the physical and social landscape of the continent. Labor shortages forced engineers to rethink every process, every tool, every inch of urban design. Suddenly, the luxury of human muscle was a relic of the past, and machines became the new workforce. Windmills tell part of this surprising story. Before the plague, grinding grain was backbreaking labor, done by teams of workers turning heavy millstones. But as villages found themselves with more fields than farmers, engineers adapted Dutch windmill designs to harness the relentless North Sea winds. These weren't just copies of old technology, they were marvels of precision. Craftsmen added adjustable sails that could be trimmed like a ship's rigging to capture even the faintest breeze, and fantail gears that automatically turned the mill to face changing wind directions. A single windmill could do the work of 50 men, and it never fell sick. By 1400, the skyline of Northern Europe bristled with these wooden giants, their rhythmic creaking a testament to crisis-born innovation. Mechanical clocks became another unlikely hero of the post-plague world. Before the Black Death, timekeeping was erratic. Church bells rang at the vague discretion of monks, and workdays stretched or shrank with the seasons. But as trade networks strained under labor shortages, synchronization became critical. Enter the weight-driven clock, a complex mesh of gears and escapements that could keep time with unerring accuracy. These weren't just timepieces, they were the first step toward industrialization. Clock towers rose above town squares, their chimes regimenting work shifts, market hours, and even the pace of construction projects. For the first time, efficiency wasn't just valued, it was engineered into the rhythm of daily life. Cities themselves underwent radical transformations. Narrow, filth-choked alleys had been death traps during the plague, so engineers redesigned urban layouts with ruthless logic. In Florence, officials widened streets not for aesthetics, but to allow sunlight, nature's disinfectant, to penetrate every corner. Drainage systems once meant only to prevent flooding were reimagined as public health tools, with graded channels directing waste away from wells and cisterns. Even building materials changed. Lime wash, once a simple finish, was now applied thickly for its antiseptic properties, giving villages their characteristic whitewashed glow. Perhaps the most profound shift was psychological. The plague shattered the medieval mindset of inevitability. If a disease could upend society, why not rebuild it better? Engineers began experimenting with prefabrication, standardized window frames, precut stones, to speed construction with fewer workers. Crop rotation systems were refined to maximize yields with minimal labor, while 3-field farming became 4-field, squeezing every ounce of productivity from the soil. Even warfare adapted. The labor-intensive trebuchet gave way to the more efficient cannon, requiring fewer hands to operate. The legacy of this era still pulses through modern life. The same principles that drove windmill innovation led to steam engines and eventually electricity. Urban planning born from plague prevention evolved into today's public health infrastructure. What the Black Death taught engineers, and what every crisis since has reinforced, is that necessity doesn't just breed invention. It demands revolutions in how we harness the world around us. The next time you glance at a clock or walk down a sunlit street, remember, sometimes progress doesn't come from abundance, but from the stark realization that the old ways simply won't survive. The thunderous roar of early cannons didn't just shatter castle walls, it shattered an entire way of thinking. When gunpowder arrived in Europe in the 14th century, medieval engineers faced their greatest challenge yet: how to defend against a weapon that could pulverize stone like dry chalk. The answer lay not in building thicker walls, but in reimagining their very shape. enter the bastion, a jagged, angular fortress that looked less like a castle and more like a stone starfish. These geometric marvels, with their slanted walls and protruding points, were designed to deflect cannonballs like a shield turned sideways. A direct hit would glance off the angled surfaces, dissipating energy rather than absorbing it. The medieval era's towering vertical walls, once symbols of invincibility, had become liabilities overnight. The transformation was starkest in places like Italy's Forte di Belvedere, where engineers scrapped centuries of tradition to create a new language of defense. Gone were the romantic turrets and soaring keeps. In their place rose low, sprawling complexes with walls so thick and angled that they seemed to grow from the earth itself. The star-shaped design wasn't just about deflection, it eliminated blind spots, allowing overlapping fields of fire from every angle. Cannons mounted on the bastion's points could rake attacking forces with crossfire, turning the fortress into a deadly geometric puzzle. Engineers even calculated the optimal angle for walls, usually between 10 and 15 degrees, to maximize ricochets while minimizing construction costs. This wasn't just architecture, it was applied physics on a monumental scale. Yet for all their innovation, these new forts marked the end of an era. The same engineers who once designed soaring cathedrals now found themselves crouching behind earthen ramparts, their artistry constrained by the relentless logic of artillery. The shift was cultural as much as technological. Where medieval builders had inscribed their walls with sculptures and heraldry, Renaissance fortresses were stripped of ornament, their beauty lying solely in mathematical precision. The human element, the stonemason's chisel, the carpenter's joint, was replaced by standardized measurements and mass-produced components. War had become industrialized, and engineers were its first factory foremen. But the medieval legacy refused to fade entirely. The same meticulous record-keeping that had guided cathedral construction now documented cannon trajectories and powder ratios. The guild's apprentice systems evolved into formal schools of military engineering, preserving centuries of hard-won knowledge. Most importantly, the medieval engineers' empirical approach to testing, observing, refining laid the groundwork for the scientific method. When Galileo later studied projectile motion, he stood on the shoulders of those who had spent generations watching stones fly from trebuchets, the final irony. Many of the greatest star forts were built by men trained in the old traditions. They took the medieval mastery of materials and geometry and bent it to a new purpose, proving that even in obsolescence, their predecessors' wisdom held value. The cannons might have ended the age of castles, but they couldn't erase the centuries of innovation that made those castles possible. And as we'll see next, some of those medieval minds belonged to figures history almost forgot, women who shaped empires from the shadows. History remembers the names of kings and master builders, but beneath the soaring arches and fortified walls lies another story, one written by hands rarely credited in official records. Take Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess whose convents buzzed with engineering marvels. While her religious writings earned fame, her hydraulic systems were equally visionary. Channels carved with mathematical precision directed fresh spring water through her convent's kitchens, infirmary, and even a gravity-fed fountain in the herb garden, an innovation that blended piety with practicality. Her designs weren't just functional, they were acts of devotion, turning water into a sacred thread connecting daily life to divine order. Yet Hildegard was no outlier. Across Europe, women worked as unsung partners in construction, their contributions often hidden behind male signatures or guild restrictions. In Lincoln, records show a widow named Agnes taking over her stonemason husband's contracts after his death, completing cathedral repairs with such skill that the bishop hired her directly for future projects. At Chartres, anonymous needlework in stained glass windows, long assumed to be men's work, bears stitching patterns matching contemporary embroidery techniques, suggesting workshops where women shaped light itself with colored glass and lead. The tools they left behind whisper hints of their ingenuity. A 14th century sketchbook from Paris includes a peculiar drawing, a crane modified with a treadwheel small enough to be operated by a single person, likely a woman, given the scale. Nearby, notations describe a mortar mix using egg whites for extra adhesion, a recipe that mirrors contemporary cooking techniques. These weren't just adaptations, they were innovations born from domestic knowledge intersecting with engineering problems. Even in warfare, women's fingerprints linger. During the siege of Montségur, defenders relied on a network of hidden cisterns fed by an elaborate rainwater collection system, a design matching descriptions from the letters of a noblewoman named Esclarmonde, who oversaw the castle stores. Though chroniclers credited male engineers with the defenses, Esclarmonde's detailed notes on water retention and distribution suggest her role was far more than supervisory. The real tragedy isn't just that these stories were forgotten, it's how their erasure distorts our understanding of medieval technology. When we picture a master builder, we imagine a bearded man in a leather apron, yet convents and households were hotbeds of experimentation. A nun grinding lenses for optical experiments, a merchant's wife refining looms to weave stronger siege tent fabric, a farmer's daughter devising a new yoke design to spare oxen strain, each contributed to the era's engineering leaps. Their legacy survives in subtle ways, the ergonomic curves of a butter churn that inspired pulley shapes, the weaving patterns informing reinforced masonry designs. What makes their absence from records even more striking is how openly some contemporaries acknowledged their skills. The architect Villard de Honnecourt's famous sketchbook includes a rare notation praising a woman named Sabine for her method of calculating vault weights, yet no buildings bear her name. Perhaps the greatest testament to their influence lies in the resistance it provoked. Guild statutes from York explicitly barred women from signing contracts, while Florentine craft ordinances fretted about wives meddling in their husbands' workshops prove that their contributions were significant enough to threaten established power structures. These women didn't just adapt to the medieval world, they quietly reinvented it. Every time a trebuchet's counterweight dropped or a cathedral's vault held firm, their uncredited calculations and modifications played a role. Their stories remind us that history's most enduring structures weren't built by solitary geniuses but by countless hands, some holding quills, some trowels, and some, quite literally, the threads that bound the medieval world together. The light filtering through the stained glass of Chartres Cathedral didn't just illuminate scripture, it carried the fingerprints of Arabic scholars who had unlocked the secrets of optics centuries earlier. Medieval Europe's engineering revolution wasn't born in isolation. It was woven from threads of knowledge stretching from Baghdad to Barcelona. When Adelard of Bath disguised himself as a Muslim student to study in Cordoba's libraries, he wasn't just collecting exotic texts, he was smuggling the very ideas that would later allow Gothic cathedrals to soar. Arabic treatises like Alhazen's Book of Optics didn't just describe light. They provided the mathematical formulas engineers used to calculate window placements, ensuring biblical scenes blazed with celestial brilliance at precise hours. This was science sanctified Euclid's geometry filtered through Damascus and reborn as divine radiance. Water tells an even more dramatic story of this cross-pollination. In the arid landscapes of Andalusia, Moorish engineers had perfected the Noria, a massive water wheel powered by river currents alone, its wooden paddles lifting thousands of gallons daily to irrigate terraced farms. When Christian kingdoms reclaimed Toledo in the 11th century, they didn't dismantle these systems, they replicated them. the monastery of Los Hulgas near Burgos became an unlikely showcase for Islamic hydraulics, its gardens fed by channels engineered with the same precision as Granada's Alhambra. These weren't just technical borrowings, they were acts of agricultural alchemy, turning Europe's rain-fed fields into year-round breadbaskets. Arches reveal the most visible fusion of traditions. The pointed arch, later the hallmark of Gothic cathedrals, first appeared in Europe not through some spontaneous inspiration, but through Crusaders' sketches of Syrian mosques. Muslim masons had refined the form to distribute weight more efficiently, allowing thinner walls and taller spaces. French engineers adapted this innovation with a twist. By pairing pointed arches with ribbed vaults, they created skeletal frameworks that could support unprecedented heights. The Abbey of St. Denis, rebuilt in the 12th century, became the testing ground for this hybrid style, its choir seeming to float on pillars as slender as reeds, thanks to calculations derived from Arabic geometry manuals. The exchange wasn't just one-directional. European clockmakers' gear systems found their way into Arabic astrolabes, while Byzantine dome techniques transformed Ottoman mosques. In Sicily, Norman kings employed Muslim engineers to design palaces where Arabic cooling systems, wind towers funneling breezes through marble ducts, made scorching summers bearable for their Frankish lords. This was no clash of civilizations, but a centuries-long collaboration where knowledge flowed as freely as the spices along the Silk Road. Perhaps the most poignant evidence lies in the tools themselves. A compass recovered from a 13th century Venetian shipwreck bears inscriptions in both Latin and Arabic, its needle aligned to Mecca rather than north. The dividers used to lay out Exeter Cathedral's floor plan match those depicted in Persian manuscripts. Even the humble mason's square, the symbol of European guilds, evolved from Islamic carpentry tools brought back by pilgrims. These objects remind us that the medieval world's greatest structures weren't triumphs of any single culture, but monuments to humanity's shared genius for turning ideas into stone, water, and light. The parchment crackled under the master builder's fingers as he unrolled the plans for Burgos Cathedral. Not just sketches, but a web of inked calculations specifying every stone's dimensions down to the width of a thumbnail. These weren't mere blueprints, they were legal documents binding contracts between faith and physics. What made medieval engineering truly revolutionary wasn't just the soaring vaults or cunning siege engines, but the paper trails that made them possible. Behind every ton of lifted limestone stood an army of clerks wielding quills instead of chisels, turning abstract geometry into enforceable law. Consider the contract for Burgos's flying buttresses, preserved in the cathedral archives. The agreement stipulates not just the curve of each arch, but the exact source quarry for the limestone, the moisture content of the mortar, even the minimum thickness of winter ice allowed on the scaffolding before work must cease. Such precision required new bureaucratic machinery, standardized measurement systems where a royal foot became consistent across kingdoms, surveyor chains calibrated against iron rods kept under lock and key. At Milan's cathedral workshop, engineers developed a revolutionary accounting system. Each stone block received a numbered tag corresponding to ledger entries tracking its quarrying, transport, and final placement. This wasn't just record keeping, it was the birth of supply chain management. The true power of these systems revealed itself when projects spanned generations. When the original architect of Cologne Cathedral died after 50 years of work, his successors didn't guess at his intentions. They consulted his library Picturotti, bound volumes where every decorative finial and load-bearing column was mathematically defined. These manuscripts functioned like medieval APIs, allowing new teams to seamlessly continue construction centuries later. Even failures were meticulously documented. The collapse of Beauvais Cathedral's vault in 1284 spawned an inquest report analyzing grain direction in the fractured stones, an early example of forensic engineering. Legal frameworks evolved in tandem. The Master Mason's Oath from Strasbourg imposed penalties for deviations from approved plans, 3 silver marks for every inch a wall veered off specification. Contracts began including insurance clauses, like one for Seville's dockworks that required the engineer to personally compensate any merchant whose goods were damaged by structural flaws. This accountability transformed construction from ad hoc craftsmanship into a regulated industry. The paperwork revolution even reshaped labor dynamics. Guilds developed standardized wage scales tied to skill tiers, with bonuses for hazardous tasks like tower scaffolding. At Canterbury, payroll records show precise deductions for rainy days when work paused, medieval timesheets tracking productivity to the hour. Such systems didn't just build cathedrals, they built the very concept of professionalized labor that still structures our workplaces today. What began as scratchings on vellum became the invisible scaffolding of empire. When Henry V needed to rapidly build siege engines for his French campaigns, he didn't rely on verbal instructions. He shipped pre-cut templates and material requisition forms to his border castles. Standardization meant a trebuchet built in Dover could be replicated in Calais with identical performance. The true marvel wasn't the machines themselves, but the bureaucratic infrastructure that made them reliably reproducible across continents. These paper networks reached their zenith with the emergence of public works departments. Venice's Magistrato alle Acque, established in 1506, maintained detailed hydrological maps showing every canal's depth, current speed, and tidal patterns, data updated annually by teams of engineer bureaucrats. Their filing system was so thorough that modern restorers still consult their 500-year-old floodgate maintenance logs. From cathedral floors to harbor dredges, the medieval world ran on paperwork as surely as it did on mortar and muscle. The next time you admire a Gothic spire, remember, its true foundation wasn't just in stone, but in the 1,000 ink decisions that lifted it skyward. The so-called Dark Ages were anything but a time of technological slumber. In fact, they sparked some of history's most transformative innovations, hidden beneath layers of outdated stereotypes. Take the humble heavy plow, a deceptively simple tool that reshaped Europe's destiny. Unlike the light Roman plows that merely scratched the soil, this behemoth, with its curved iron blade and mold board dug deep, turning over dense, nutrient-rich earth that had lain fallow for centuries. The impact was staggering. Fields that once yielded meager harvests suddenly produced surplus grain, allowing populations to expand beyond subsistence levels. Villages sprouted where forests once stood, their growth fueled by the quiet revolution of a tool that weighed more than a grown man, yet the plow was only half the story. The invention of the padded horse collar turned the agricultural world on its head. Before this breakthrough, oxen were the beasts of burden, strong but slow. Horses, though faster, had been useless for heavy labor because traditional harnesses choked them under strain. But with the new collar distributing weight across the shoulders rather than the windpipe, a single horse could pull loads twice as fast as oxen teams. This wasn't just an upgrade, it was a logistical earthquake. Farmers could now work larger plots in less time, transport goods to markets more efficiently, and even rotate crops more frequently to prevent soil exhaustion. By the 11th century, these twin innovations had boosted agricultural productivity so dramatically that Europe's population nearly doubled, laying the groundwork for the bustling towns and trade networks of the High Middle Ages. The myth of stagnation crumbles further when examining urban infrastructure. Contrary to popular belief, medieval cities were hotbeds of ingenuity. In London, engineers designed underground cesspits lined with waterproof mortar, some so well constructed they're still intact today. Parisian streets featured graded drainage channels that funneled rainwater into the Seine, reducing the cholera outbreaks that plagued later centuries. Even small towns boasted water-powered mills grinding grain, fulling cloth, and forging tools, miniature industrial hubs humming with activity. Perhaps the most telling evidence lies in the era's mechanical breakthroughs. The verge escapement, a 13th century invention, transformed timekeeping by regulating the movement of clock gears with unprecedented precision. Soon, town squares across Europe featured towering clocks that didn't just tell time, they orchestrated it, synchronizing markets, worship, and labor with rhythmic efficiency. This wasn't the work of primitive minds, it was the hallmark of a society mastering the marriage of mechanics and mathematics. The real darkness wasn't in the period itself, but in how later generations chose to remember it. Renaissance scholars, eager to glorify their own era, painted the preceding centuries as a monolithic void. Yet the records tell a different story, one of experimentation, adaptation, and quiet brilliance. From the moldboard plough's furrows to the rhythmic ticking of cathedral clocks, medieval engineers weren't just keeping the lights on, they were building the scaffolding of the modern world. Their legacy whispers a reminder: progress isn't always loud, but it's relentless, even in the shadows. The night Beauvais Cathedral's spire crashed to the ground in 1284, the sound carried more than shattered stone, it carried the death of an ambition. At 150 meters, it had been the tallest structure in Christendom, a dizzying testament to human daring, but ambition outpaced physics that evening. The vaults groaned, the pillars trembled, and in a heartbeat, years of labor lay in ruins. Yet this wasn't just a failure, it was a masterclass in how disaster drives progress. The surviving masons didn't despair, they became detectives combing through the rubble for clues. What they discovered revolutionized engineering. The limestone piers, slender and elegant, had been crushed by their own beauty. The weight distribution was flawless in theory but fatally flawed in practice. From that moment, no architect would ever again trust aesthetics alone to bear a building's burden. Similar tragedies became textbooks written in broken stone. When Winchester Cathedral's original tower collapsed in 1107, engineers realized the soft clay beneath its foundations had liquefied during heavy rains. The solution, a radical innovation, floating rafts of oak beams crisscrossed beneath the new structure, distributing weight like snowshoes on mud. Centuries later, when the Leaning Tower of Pisa began its infamous tilt, builders applied these same principles in reverse, carefully removing soil from one side to correct the angle. Each catastrophe wasn't an ending, but an experiment with the highest stakes imaginable. The most transformative failures often came from pushing materials beyond their limits. Chartres Cathedral's early 13th century builders learned this the hard way when their thin, delicate window tracery cracked under winter winds. Their patchwork solution iron reinforcement rods hidden within the stone became the prototype for modern tensile architecture. At Ely Cathedral, a collapsing central tower in the 14th century forced engineers to devise an octagonal wooden lantern, a structure so lightweight yet sturdy it still crowns the building today. These weren't just repairs, they were leaps forward disguised as retreats. Even warfare's disasters fueled innovation. The infamous collapse of Chait au Gaillard's latrine tower during a siege in 1204, a humiliation for King John, revealed how attackers could exploit poorly placed waste chutes to undermine walls. Future castles relocated their guardrabes over sheer cliffs or moats, turning sanitation into security. Similarly, when early cannons unpredictably exploded due to inconsistent metal casting, the accidents birthed new metallurgical standards, with foundries adopting bell-making techniques to produce stronger, more reliable barrels. The true legacy of these failures lies in their documentation. Unlike ancient builders whose mistakes were lost to time, medieval engineers meticulously recorded their disasters. The Beauvais inquest included witness testimonies, sketches of fracture patterns, even samples of the failed mortar. These reports circulated among guilds like cautionary tales, ensuring one city's collapse became every architect's education. Today's safety codes and stress tests descend directly from this tradition of transforming rubble into wisdom. What makes these stories so compelling isn't just the ingenuity born from ruin, but the humility behind it. The master mason who raised Beauvais's spire too high likely knew the risk but dared anyway. That tension between ambition and restraint, vision and reality still defines engineering. Every modern skyscraper, every suspension bridge, carries the ghost of those medieval failures in its calculations. The next time you marvel at a soaring structure, remember, its height was earned not just by what stood, but by what fell. The rhythmic creak of a wine press squeezing grapes in 14th century Rhineland might seem worlds apart from the clatter of Gutenberg's printing press, but listen closely, the echoes are unmistakable. That same screw mechanism used to extract juice from fruit became the beating heart of the first mass-produced books. Medieval engineers didn't just build castles, they crafted the very tools that would democratize knowledge. The connection goes deeper than mechanics. Paper mills, another medieval innovation, provided the literal substrate for revolution. Before these water-powered factories, books were scribbled on costly parchment sheepskin so expensive that a single Bible required herds. But when Spanish paper mills, adapted from Arab designs, began pulping rags into sheets, they slashed the cost of writing material by 90%. Suddenly, the stage was set for a machine that could stamp words as efficiently as a wine press crushed grapes. Gutenberg's genius lay in synthesis. He combined existing technologies like a master alchemist. The metal screws from olive presses became adjustable platens to press ink evenly onto paper. The coin punches used by royal mints evolved into reusable type molds. Even the ink itself was a medieval concoction, adapted from artists' linseed oil mixtures but thickened with soot to cling to metal letters. Each component had been perfected over centuries for other purposes, waiting for someone to assemble them into a knowledge machine. The real breakthrough wasn't the press itself, but the ecosystem that made it viable. Medieval engineers had spent generations refining precision tools, calipers for measuring barrel staves, compasses for laying out cathedral floors, that now ensured each piece of type was identical down to a hair's width. Guild standards for metal alloys, originally developed for church bells, guaranteed the type wouldn't melt under pressure. Even the press's wooden frame owed its strength to advances in carpentry, with mortise and tenon joints borrowed from cathedral roofing. This wasn't invention from nothing, it was centuries of mechanical wisdom converging. The ripple effects were staggering. Just as wine presses transformed vineyards into engines of commerce, printing presses turned scriptoria into factories of thought. A single press could produce in a day what a scribe took a year to copy, and with fewer errors, but the most subversive impact was invisible: standardized spelling. Before print, words sprawled across manuscripts in regional variations. Church might be Ceres, Circe, or Kirk, depending on the scribe's dialect. The press locked language into uniform shapes, quietly forging national identities. What began as monastic tinkering, a better way to stamp pilgrim badges or press communion wafers, ended up shattering the medieval world order. When Luther's 95 Theses spread like wildfire in 1517, it wasn't just theology igniting Europe. It was the culmination of 3 centuries of mechanical iteration. The press's power lay not in its novelty, but in its proof that engineering's influence could transcend physical structures and reshape the very fabric of thought. Those who dismiss the Middle Ages as backward miss the truth. The information age didn't begin with silicon chips, but with the slow, steady turn of screws pressed first into grapes, then into history itself. Look up at the steel skeleton of a modern skyscraper, and you're seeing the ghost of a medieval cathedral. Those crisscrossing beams aren't just holding up glass and concrete, they're whispering secrets first discovered by stonemasons 800 years ago. The truss systems that brace today's towers owe their DNA to the ribbed vaults of Chartres and Reims, where medieval engineers cracked the code of load distribution. Picture a Gothic cathedral ceiling, slender stone ribs fanning outward like the veins of a leaf, channeling weight down to specific points. That same principle now governs steel frameworks, where diagonal beams redirect forces to reinforced columns. The materials have changed, but the physics remains timeless. Consider the Eiffel Tower, a 19th century structure that might as well be a love letter to medieval thinking. Gustave Eiffel openly admitted his design borrowed from the flying buttresses of Notre Dame, replacing stone with iron but keeping the genius intact. Those graceful arches at the base, they mirror the way cathedral builders widened foundations to disperse weight, just as modern architects thicken lower columns in skyscrapers. Even earthquake-resistant buildings use medieval-inspired shock absorption. The same flexibility engineers built into tall spires to sway with wind loads now lets towers ride out seismic waves. The parallels go deeper than structure. Medieval stonemasons developed early versions of quality control, chiseling identification marks into blocks so flaws could be traced back to the quarry, a practice echoed today in steel beam serial numbers. Their mortar recipes, meticulously adjusted for local climates, foreshadowed modern concrete mixes engineered for specific environments. And just as cathedral workshops used full-scale wooden templates to test arch designs, contemporary architects now rely on digital 3D modeling for the same purpose. The tools have evolved from compasses to 3D software, but the iterative process remains unchanged. Perhaps the most striking legacy lies in sustainability. Medieval builders were masters of passive climate control, thick stone walls storing daytime heat, strategically placed windows funneling cross breezes. Those techniques are experiencing a renaissance in green architecture, with thermal mass materials and natural ventilation replacing energy-guzzling systems. The towers of Dubai and Shanghai may gleam with glass, but their smart shading systems owe a debt to the carved stone screens that cooled Cordoba's mosques. What makes these medieval minds truly proto-engineers wasn't just their solutions, but their systematic approach. They documented failures like the Beauvais collapse with forensic detail, creating the first known case studies in structural analysis. Their guilds functioned as early professional societies, certifying competencies and sharing innovations across Europe. When a modern engineer calculates load tolerances or stress tests a prototype, they're walking a path paved by those who first turned intuition into equations. The next time you ride an elevator to a skyscraper's observation deck, remember, you're not just ascending a building, you're climbing through layers of accumulated wisdom, each floor supported by ideas forged in the quarries and drafting tables of the medieval world. Those ancient builders may have worked with chisels rather than calculators, but their legacy stands taller than ever, etched not just in stone but in the very skyline of our city.